Alongside all its many other glories, the Bible contains the most famous letters ever written.
O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face.
The man who wrote them, a Jew from an obscure corner of the Roman Empire by the name of Paul, did more to transform the moral and ethical presumptions of the ancient world than anyone else. The notions he advocated could hardly have been more unsettling to a Greek or a Roman. That equality might be a positive, that change might be a good. Look to make the world fairer today, and you owe a debt of gratitude to Paul. His teachings are the pivot on which classical antiquity, and therefore the whole subsequent course of Western history, turns. So profoundly did Paul shape the way that we in the West have ordered our sexuality, our society, our very sense of what it is to be human, that even now, 2 millennia on, Paul's influence is akin to the air we breathe. Paul, this figure from the earliest years of the spread of Jesus' message, is often seen now as being hopelessly out of step. Worse than that, the charge laid against him is that he twisted and corrupted Jesus' teachings. You have Jesus, a mellow, bead-wearing hippie, and then you have Paul, the square who ruins it all. His letters, 13 in all, account for no less than a quarter of the entire New Testament. And he ranks second only to Jesus himself as the founder of Christianity. But today, Paul's words are quoted against him to write him off for being authoritarian,
The powers that be are ordained of God.
for being sexist,
The head of the woman is the man.
for being an uptight homophobe,
The men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men working that which is unseemly.
And yet here's the thing, the same Paul who condemns fornicators is also the author of the greatest description of love ever written. This is the church where I got married, and I can remember before the wedding thumbing through the Bible, trying to find a suitable passage for a reading. And to be frank, much of it seemed grotesquely unsuitable. Lots of smitings, lots of thou shalt nots. Now, it's true that there was the one love poem, the Song of Solomon.
Thy 2 breasts are like 2 young roes that are twins.
But didn't really want that read out in front of my mother. So in the end, like so many other couples, we went for the obvious, the cliched, the transcendent option. The first epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Corinthians, chapter 13.
If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. So faith, hope, love abide, these 3. But the greatest of these is love.
Yeah, and so what? Many may be tempted to shrug. But as the theory of evolution teaches us, we're all of us the product of our origins. I'm a historian of antiquity. It obsesses me partly because of the inherent fascination of Greek and Roman civilization, but also because, in a sense, it helped to make me what I am. And the same, but even more so, is true of Paul's letters. Just because they're in the Bible doesn't mean that we should ever forget that they too, like democracy or tragedy or philosophy, are rooted in the world of our beginnings. Like Jesus, his contemporary whom he never knew, Paul, or Saul as he was originally called, was a Jew. But unlike Jesus, he'd been born well beyond the limits of the Holy Land. Saul was a native of Tarsus, no mean city, as he described it. It lay in what is now the southeastern corner of Turkey. Back then, it was a region called Cilicia. Tarsus itself had always had close links with the world of Greece, and these had been immeasurably strengthened when Alexander the Great conquered the city in the 4th century BC. It's this that explains why Saul's native language wasn't Hebrew, but Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. But there was a further dimension to Saul's multifaceted cultural identity. 300 years on from Alexander, and Tarsus had come under the rule of a new superpower. Saul's father, it seems, we don't know how or why, had managed to get on the right side of the conquerors. So much so, in fact, that he had ended up being awarded a grant of citizenship. This was why Saul, a Jew, a speaker of Greek, was also a citizen of Rome. But what were the relations between Jews and the pagan world? Was there a difference between the Jews who live in Palestine and the Jews who live beyond the limits of the Holy Land in the broader Roman world?
Yes and no. I mean, of course, both Jew and Gentile, Gentile, of course, being non-Jew in Jewish terms, were all part of the broader Roman world anyway. But there were certain differences. In the land of Israel, in Palestine, you have the temple and you have certain laws that apply to Jews in the land of Israel. In the diaspora being Jews outside the land of Israel, across the Roman Empire, you have different social contexts. You have Jews living in largely pagan cities. And so there are two different worlds in that sense, but of course both are having to deal with the Roman Empire at large. Now, Paul is a product of both of these. He comes from a cosmopolitan context, from Tarsus, but he also gets trained as a Pharisee.
Which meant that Saul was every inch a stickler for Jewish tradition. To be a Pharisee was to be devoted to the study of the Jews' most precious inheritance. Way back, God had appeared to the prophet Moses and given him an immense body of instructions, ritual, practical, moral. Follow these, God had declared, and you will have my favour. Such had been the origins of the Torah, the law. When the followers of an executed criminal named Jesus started preaching not only that their leader had risen from the dead, but that he was actually the Son of God, the fervent young Jew from Tarsus was outraged by the blasphemy. This new sect had to be crushed. Saul was there watching when the first follower of Jesus to be martyred was stoned to death. And when others fled Jerusalem for Damascus in Syria, Saul was close behind,
breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord.
Something would happen to him on the road to Damascus, something that would transform not only Saul's life, but the very course of global history. In around the year AD 33, Saul, a young Jew exceedingly zealous for the traditions of his forefathers, and a wholehearted persecutor of the followers of Jesus, was on a road trip. According to the Acts of the Apostles, the book of the Bible which narrates the first spread of the Christian mission out into the world, Saul had a vision right here on the road to Damascus. He fell to the earth. Jesus spoke to him.
Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest.
Saul was struck blind. He was led into the city.
And he was 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink.
And the stunned and bewildered Saul was visited by a man named Ananias, a disciple who once, according to tradition, lived in this very house. And Ananias laid his hands on Saul.
And immediately there fell from his eyes as it had been scales, and he received sight forthwith, and arose, and was baptized.
It's a strange and haunting story, and a mysterious one too. We'll never know what really happened at Damascus, but what we can know is what Saul thought had happened. He had seen the risen Christ. But he hadn't been converted. There was as yet no religion that we would recognise as Christianity for him to be converted to. Saul remained what he had always been, a Jew. And yet it is telling that from this point on in Acts, it's the Greek form of his name which is used. A really profound transformation is being suggested here.
Old things are passed away. Behold, all things have become new.
But what did this mean for a man such as Paul had previously been? A Jew zealous in his belief that God had chosen Israel for his special favour. If it was now the knowledge of Christ which promised salvation, then what role, if any, did this leave for the law, the framework for living that had been given to the Jews by God himself, and which governed every aspect of Jewish life? Now, Paul had a particular reason why he believed the law no longer mattered. His vision of the future was a startlingly radical one. He believed he'd been called to preach the good news of Christ to the Gentiles, to the Greeks and Romans, to all those who did not observe the Jewish law. Now, it takes a bit of mental gear shifting to appreciate just how startling and original a notion this actually was. We're so used to the idea of Christian missionaries that we tend to assume, I think, that preaching the word to the heathen is just the kind of thing that Christians do. But not in the time of Paul. He was aiming at something bizarre, heroic, unprecedented in the scope of its ambition. Nothing less than the conversion of the world. And it's the measure of his achievement that the ultimate consequence of this would be the emergence of Christianity. Nowadays, the largest religion on the face of the planet, with over 2 billion adherents. Province by Roman province, Paul aimed to spread the news of Jesus to the world, and fast. The end days, he believed, were at hand. Christ would soon return. Time was running out. The world was about to end. So off he went. Now, travel in the ancient world was always dangerous.
Thrice I suffered shipwreck.
Paul would boast.
A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers.
But all that granted, getting around the Mediterranean was probably easier in Paul's lifetime than it had ever been in history. Roman power had shrunk the world, and Paul took full advantage. But he was entering a crowded market. By travelling from Mediterranean city to Mediterranean city, preaching his understanding of the truth to the Gentiles, to those who weren't Jewish, Paul was going head to head with the classical world's dominant intellectual tradition. The Greeks could read Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus. Why should they listen to Paul's claim that God was a crucified criminal? No surprise, then, that the place where he had his most demoralising experience of all, where he realised just what he was up against, should have been Athens, the powerhouse of philosophy. This is Speaker's Corner in London. It's a place where anyone with a case to make is free to come and make it. And it's probably the closest we have to the Areopagus, the hill in Athens where Paul went to preach the resurrection of Christ.
For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing.
Speaker's Corner is unique in the world. There's no other place like it. There's no other place where we can get up and actually say the things we say, ask the questions we ask, and get the response that we get on a weekly basis. It's free, and it's right in the middle of London. I like Speaker's Corner specifically because it's so much like the environment that Paul came from.
Up in heaven, totally distant. He cannot hear.
Paul's the best man for confrontation. Everywhere he went, he confronted. Every people that he met, he confronted. He was a very well-known and certainly well-respected man because of his intellect. Fortunately, because of the fact that he was able to take people on their own terms, almost on any subject.
And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, "We will hear thee again on this matter."
Hardly the most ringing of endorsements. And really, you can get a sense here, the sheer playground feel of it, the clamour of different opinions, of the kind of problems that faced Paul. How was he to stop people from just shrugging his message aside? An awkward question, but one to which Paul very urgently needed an answer.
You see, folks, it's only fair. It's only fair.
Failed to convert the Gentiles, and Paul's ambition to establish faith in Christ as something universal would fail as well. Much was at stake. The future of the world, so Paul believed, was hanging in the balance. Paul's first Gentile convert was a genuinely big catch. Sergius Paulus was the Roman governor of Cyprus, the kind of toga-clad high flyer we see memorialised here. And Sergius was prepared to give Paul his full backing. When the apostle and his companions set off to what is now Turkey, but was then called Asia Minor, they headed straight for a region called Galatia, where Sergius Paulus had lands. This was clearly how Paul liked to conduct his missionary work, by fixing on an influential local supporter.
But how on earth had Paul managed to pull it off? Well, he was clearly a man of great vision and self-confidence, of wit and fire and passion. Even a Roman aristocrat might be swayed by qualities such as these. But there was an additional reason, perhaps, why Gentiles such as Sergius Paulus might have been willing to give Paul the kind of hearing that they would never normally have granted a Jew.
To put it plainly, Paul was telling his non-Jewish followers, like Paulus, that there was no need for them to put their privates under the knife.
Being circumcised does not make you a Jew, nor does being uncircumcised make you not a Jew. But the circumcision is the strongest sign of commitment and of the covenant between God and Abraham, the first Jew.
So would it be fair to say that circumcision has an emotional as well as a ritual significance for most Jews?
Yes, I think that is true. The circumcision gives this sense of participation, emotional connection. In communities where Jews have been persecuted, circumcision has sometimes been banned, which is a matter of tremendous heartache to Jewish communities, and Jews have always put themselves out to ensure that their sons are circumcised.
But Paul, preaching to Sergius Paulus and then to the Galatians, tells them this ritual is no longer necessary. It is not that he was hostile to circumcision for Jewish baby boys, merely that he felt the whole issue for his Gentile converts was a glaring irrelevance.
Once, before his vision of Christ on the road to Damascus, Paul had believed that it was the differences between Jew and Greek that really counted. But now, he told his followers, difference itself had become a matter of indifference.
There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus.
But Paul's line on circumcision was destined to bring him into conflict with other proclaimers of Christ's message. Several years after his first visit to Galatia, Paul wrote the churches there a letter. And this, preserved in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, is the oldest known copy, from the end of the 2nd century.
I mean, it sends a shiver down the spine to look at this and feel that you are that close to Paul, but also a sort of measure of frustration that you have this gap and you can't quite get back there. How close do you think this brings us to Paul?
My own feeling is that it brings us very close to Paul. It may not look a very impressive object, but we're looking at one of the earliest Christian artefacts of any kind, written by the hand of one of these very, very early Christians. We're looking at communication between an elite. They will then read out these letters to the community, and the vast majority of Christians would have heard the letters being read, and that's how they came into contact with Paul's writings. Every Christian community who wants to know anything about Paul had to have a copy of those letters. So they generated other copies as they were distributed through the early Christian communities.
The letter to the Galatians is Paul's most combative, personal and emotional piece of writing. Not a formal statement of doctrine, but rather the biblical equivalent of an email fired off in the heat of the moment.
So what had prompted it? Well, what seems to have happened is that the Galatians, having been converted by Paul, now wanted, as it were, to go the whole hog. They wanted to become properly Jewish. They wanted to be circumcised. Paul is furious. And what makes him all the more livid is the fact that rival Christian missionaries are treading on his patch. Missionaries who are telling the Galatians that, yes, you do need to be circumcised.
He wrote angrily of these missionaries,
I would they were even cut off which trouble you.
As the King James Version has it, which, updated, roughly translates as, cut off their ghoulies.
Elsewhere, Paul's tone is more poignant. I stand in doubt of you, he tells the Galatians. You can feel his pain, his despair. Take the leap of faith, he is begging. Believe that we're all of us Christ's, circumcised and uncircumcised alike. In his words,
Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law.
When Paul tells his followers that they no longer need to follow the Jewish law, that all they require is the Spirit of Christ, do you feel that that is a valid pitch?
It's very attractive to offer people the sublime end that Jewish law and tradition promises the adherent, but without making any of the demands of commitment. After all, Jewish law is very demanding, it's very rigorous, it invades and penetrates every aspect of one's life, from birth to death, from morning to night. And selling that to people as a desirable lifestyle is quite a hard sell. Selling people, on the other hand, that they'll get all the outcome without having to observe the laws, that's quite an attractive sell.
Paul felt the Jewish law was no longer needed. Faith in Christ was all that mattered. But this threatened a dilemma, one which we have still not resolved today. In a world without rules, what's to stop us doing whatever we like?
Now, Paul doesn't want to think that this is a problem. Paul wants to think that if you have the knowledge of Christ, then whoosh, you also automatically have the fruits of that knowledge. Joy, love, peace. Paul is hippie, if you like. But what if that whole Woodstock spirit is then taken too far? Paul has been telling people, no, you don't need the law. But now news reaches him of a Christian in the Greek city of Corinth who, scandalously, has been going around telling people that he has a license from God to sleep with his father's wife. Such fornication, Paul writes, as is not so much as named among the Gentiles. Which is really saying something, because Corinth traditionally had always had a really sleazy reputation.
So much so, in fact, that the very word Korinthiatsein, to play the Corinthian, meant in Greek to fornicate.
Even though the heyday of the city as a destination for sex tourists was long gone, Paul, writing to the Corinthians, must surely have had it in his mind.
And so he's forced to acknowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, the Spirit of Christ on its own is not actually enough. And that even if you have accepted the Spirit of Christ into your life, you might still need laws telling you how to behave after all.
Paul is the conduit for what's called the Code of Holiness of Leviticus. This is the one which says that men who sleep with men like women should be put to death, basically. So St. Paul is the link between the strictures of the Old Testament and the modern Christian world. So he gets rid of an awful lot of the old Jewish law. He gets rid of the dietary requirements. He gets rid of the need to be circumcised. But he likes to keep in some of these other prescriptions against homosexuality, against fornication. He is the authority for bringing those back into the church. So he picks and chooses.
So here is the fundamental tension in Paul's thought. On the one hand, he's preaching a revolutionary new order. The relationship between God and his people is no longer defined by the law, but by the Spirit of Christ.
On the other hand, he doesn't want to say to the churches that they can just do anything they like.
When it comes to issues of morality, Paul is absolutely the product of his Jewish upbringing. He's simply not prepared to compromise with the moral presumptions of pagans.
Women should cover their hair. The only natural union is that of husband and wife. For people of the same sex to sleep with one another is wrong. Paul may have proclaimed the irrelevance of the Jewish law, but on the question of gay rights, he was quite as disapproving as Moses. It's a Sunday night, but it's a fair bet that not many people here have come from Evensong. It's very much not a St. Paul kind of a place. And yet there is a sense in which, even here, Paul's influence can be felt. The willingness of our society to condone as well as to condemn love between people of the same sex does indeed draw on his legacy. Because if our own social and moral attitudes are complex and contradictory, that's because Paul's were as well. Like anyone, he had his prejudices, and these indisputably have been part of the West's inheritance from him. But he was also a revolutionary, and part of what he aimed at overthrowing were the cultural presumptions inside his own head. He laid down laws, but he also ripped them up. In other words, he's the very opposite of inflexible. His aim is always to push against the limits of preconceptions in the name of equality and love. But it's not a slushy message. Paul is tough-minded. Indeed, on sexual matters, he makes the Jewish law look positively soft.
It is better to marry than to burn,
he writes. But it is better to avoid sex altogether than to marry.
For to be carnally minded is death.
Life in Christ is about self-mastery. It is about pushing yourself to the limits. It is about keeping your body under control and winning the prize of eternal life.
And here, to his pagan converts, is something that does speak to them. Writing to the Corinthians, Paul compares his own self-discipline to that of an athlete. Run, he says, that ye may obtain. Nothing more Greek, less Jewish than athletics. Yet here is Paul's genius. Somehow, against all the odds, he finds a way of fusing the two.
And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible.
This, to Paul, is what it is to follow Christ. It is to compete as an athlete of God. a vision of striving and spiritual struggling that would end up superseding that of the classical world altogether. It's important to appreciate just how radical was his overturning of the traditional values of the world he inhabited. Always fight bravely, Greek and Roman boys had been told, and be superior to others.
But Paul's advice to his converts among the Galatians could hardly have been more opposite. Peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness. These, so the apostle declares, are the fruits of the Spirit.
And as Paul preached, so he lived. Willingly, he called himself a doulos, a slave of Christ, and submitted to being beaten, according to his own testimony, 3 times by rods, the punishment, almost by definition, of a slave.
Good morning, Tom. Welcome. It is amazing for us at the beginning of the 21st century when we realize the power that a master had over his slave, that he could do anything, even decree death. When Paul then uses this term to describe his relationship with Jesus, namely Jesus becomes Lord, he becomes his master, Paul looks at himself as a slave. Very, very strong language, which is somewhat shocking to us. Even so much in our translations, we sometimes prefer to talk about a servant as opposed to slave. But basically what it conveys, what Paul is using here, it becomes a metaphor to describe his complete dedication to Jesus and the cause of Jesus. That he's willing to do anything to follow Jesus and to announce Jesus to Jews and non-Jews in the Roman Empire.
It also suggests scorn for a presumption deep-rooted in antiquity, that relationships were determined above all by power. Paul had abandoned the comforts of his background and willingly become, in effect, a wandering beggar. Powerlessness, Paul was saying, had become the new power. And certainly, his life was a hard one, travelling between the new Christian churches, encouraging and guiding them.
Now, we have plenty of evidence, fragmentary perhaps, but enough to be confident that Paul's missionary journeys did indeed take him across the entire span of the Roman world. But when we come to the years before his death, Paul just vanishes from the historical record.
The author of the Acts of the Apostles tells us that he ended up involved in a crowd disturbance in Jerusalem and was arrested by the Roman authorities. Paul appealed to Caesar, his right as a Roman citizen, and was sent here to Rome. He stayed under house arrest until, it's thought at least 2 years later, he was put to death.
The most popular theory is that Paul died in the first wave of persecutions against the Christians. In AD 64, there was a devastating fire in Rome. It began just over there, in shops, above the Circus Maximus, the place where the Romans raced their chariots. By the time it was finally extinguished, whole swathes of the city had been left as nothing but blackened, smoking rubble. Obviously, the imperial authorities needed a scapegoat, and so they fixed on the followers of the mysterious and deeply subversive-sounding Christ.
Legend says that Paul was executed here, where the Abbey of the Three Fountains now stands. His head was cut from his neck, it bounced 3 times, and with each bounce, a fountain sprang up. A fantastical story, perhaps. But one thing is clear enough. Paul died willingly. By submitting to an earthly king, he had won for himself a heavenly crown.
We suffer with him.
Death, however, was hardly the end of Paul's story. Paul died as he'd lived, a revolutionary. Everything had to change. This, in the context of the age, was a profoundly subversive message. His end had come, however, not on the barricades, but submissively, on the executioner's block. So what did this willingness to bow his neck before Caesar say about his attitude to the imperial state? Certainly, when Paul wrote his last great epistle to the Romans, he advised the Christians of the capital to acknowledge the authority of the higher powers.
Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God.
Many brutal regimes since, from the Nazis to the apartheid state in South Africa, have made use of this passage, making it one of the most notorious in the whole of the Bible. Was that a justifiable use of the Bible verse?
Absolutely not. It would have been a terrible misuse of that. Ultimately, I think what Paul is doing is, Paul is the absolute realist. He's accepting the world as it is. He realizes he's a citizen in the Roman Empire, and realizing nevertheless, and I think he's thinking as a very good Jew here, realizing that God, in his providential way, is overseeing the affairs of man. And as a result of that, realizing that even these authorities are legitimate and that God can work through them to accomplish his will.
Though he advised submission to Rome, Paul was no enthusiast for worldly power. We have to remember always that for Paul, the end was near. Christ's return in a blaze of glory was hourly expected. There was, for his followers, quite simply no time to reorder the world.
The night is far spent. The day is at hand.
Except that it didn't turn out that way. Time did not come to an end. Paul had not lived to see the return of Christ. The years slipped by, and new generations found themselves wrestling with the very same issues that had so troubled Paul in his own lifetime. And always, at their heart, the most sensitive issue of all. In a world redeemed by Christ, what of their Jewish heritage should be preserved? Attempts to answer that question would lead some Christians in an increasingly radical direction, with consequences that would have an incalculable impact on what would become the Christian Bible. In AD 66, the Jews rose in revolt against the Roman Empire. It was a reckless action. 4 years later, Jerusalem was captured and its treasures carted off to Rome. Christians, frantic to distance themselves from the defeated and mistrusted Jews, increasingly turned their backs on the mother religion. The kind of Christian who would provoke Paul into writing his letter to the Galatians, the kind who favoured circumcision or the law of Moses, faded from the scene. By the 2nd century AD, there were some Christians, like Marcion, a radically innovative theologian from Sinope in Asia Minor, who wanted to make the divorce between their faith in Christ and Judaism terminal. Marcion hoped to mark out the boundaries of Christian belief by drawing up a canon, an authoritative list of texts which would define Christian thought. Paul's letters were destined to play a key role.
Marcion is the first one, we think, to actually formulate a distinctively Christian canon. And in his case, it comprised solely one gospel, the Gospel of Luke, and a collection of 10 letters of the Apostle Paul, and that's it. No Old Testament or anything like that, and no other early Christian writing. He recognized only one true apostle, and for him that was Paul, and he could accommodate only one gospel rendition of Jesus' message.
I mean, that's really startling to think that he left out the whole of the Old Testament. Why did he do that?
He found all kinds of things problematic in the Old Testament. It's interesting, he didn't challenge the reality of the Old Testament God. He said, oh yeah, the God of the Jews there's a real God, and he's a God of the Jews, got nothing to do with us. And therefore, these scriptures are scriptures of the Jews. They can have them, they can do what they want to with them, but they have nothing to do with us. And he was just found it incompatible with what he understood to be the teaching of Paul in particular.
So in a sense, the response of his enemies, the attempt to combat that, resulted in the Christian Bible as we know it today.
He does appear to be to get the jump on the church as far as canon forming is concerned. And in that sense, he probably helps accelerate and helps intensify the question, well, okay, if Marcion's canon isn't adequate and isn't right, what the heck is?
Now, all of this can seem rather lacking relevance to the here and now.
But just think, for example, about the anti-Semitic uses to which Paul's letters have been put, and of which Marcion's heresy was only the first example. Biblical scholarship is not exclusively about ancient texts. It impacts directly on the here and now. And if that is obviously the case with a relationship as sensitive and significant as that between Christians and Jews, then so also is it true of an even more fundamental relationship, that between men and women.
Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence.
These assertions from the first of Paul's supposed letters to Timothy have had a fundamental impact on the way that the two genders have related to one another over the entire course of Western history. To this day, it is used as a justification by many Christians to deny the validity of women priests. Simultaneously, it is Exhibit A in the case that Paul was a snorting chauvinist pig. But here is where biblical scholarship comes into its own again. Did Paul actually write the first letter to Timothy?
In Paul's first letter to Timothy, we read, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. In the opinion of most scholars, are these the actual words of Paul himself?
No, the message that you get in Timothy there does seem to be so strikingly different from other bits of Paul's writings that many scholars would say that they aren't actually written by Paul, but were written by a Pauline community some years after Paul's death.
And why are they doing that?
The reason why the Pauline community seemed to want to write words like that might have been in order to be able to rein back some of the radical message of Paul's theology, which seemed to be immensely inclusive.
So, of the letters in the Bible that are attributed to Paul, how many do scholars think were actually by Paul himself?
There are 7 undisputed Pauline letters, and there are a number of others which are disputed more or less by scholars. Some think that there are more than 7, others say just the 7 are written by Paul.
So if, as many scholars suggest, many of these letters post-date Paul himself, what does their existence tell us about the attitudes of subsequent generations to Paul's initial radicalism?
Well, many scholars would say that what happens in the writing of Timothy is an attempt to readjust Paul's theology in the light of their current context. So if they are written after Paul's death, they began to realise that some of Paul's radicalism sits uncomfortably with the kind of Christianity that they now follow, and therefore they rewrote the texts in order to be able to represent a Christianity that they were more comfortable with.
So what is it about Paul's message on gender relations, on women, that is so unsettling, that is so radical?
I think one of the really striking features of Paul is that he throws open the doors in terms of equality, in terms of gender, and in terms of all sorts of other relationships in the community, and issues a welcome to anyone who wants to be a member of this Christ community.
No one's influence did more to shape the Bible that has been read over the centuries by millions upon millions of Christians than St. Paul. The tensions that run throughout his letters are the same that run throughout the entire practice of the Christian faith, and therefore of Western society as a whole. Between the conservative and the revolutionary, between our debt to the past and our hopes for the future, between the letter and the spirit of the law.
Today we live in a society that shrinks from looking to the Bible to define itself.
All the same, it seems to me that Paul remains the West's patron saint. More than Darwin, more than Marx, more than Freud, it's Paul, this man who died almost 2,000 years ago, who lives on inside our heads, in all his contradictions, in all his complexities. When we look at the world, we do so, for good and ill, through Pauline eyes.
There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female.
And perhaps, following the implications of his praise of love to their logical conclusions, there is neither straight nor gay as well. Unlike Paul himself, after his vision of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, we are caught between two conflicting desires. On the one hand, we want to proclaim a glorious new beginning, liberated from all Paul's tut-tuttings, all his strictures. But at the same time, we do, I think, want to continue to define ourselves in terms of the ethics, the morals, the ideals that Paul, more than any other writer, has bequeathed to us today. That we are all one, that the weak can confound the mighty, that all you need is love.
The Lord destroys with the word that proceeds out of his mouth.
In the next programme, Robert Beckford goes in search of the Book of Revelation.
The Book of Revelation speaks to everybody. It just doesn't say the same message to everybody. It doesn't always say the message that you want to hear.